All the second stage tanks now pressurized. Astronauts report it feels good. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Like a furry torpedo to the jugular. This is Honey Badger Radio. Radio with Buddy.
It's an emergency! We need funding right away!
What makes you think so?
How dare you ask me that, you misogynist!
HBR Talk with Hannah Wallen. Gynocentrism plays a big role in the ability of feminist pressure groups to influence and inform law and policy, but it is not alone in its impact. Gynocentric excuses for legislative control over male-female relationships rely on a systematic cultivation, promotion, and exploitation of a female victim identity, to be contrasted against a male threat narrative. This process involves a particular method that is used by victim identity cultists in general, feminized for feminist groups' purposes. Step 1. Create underdog. Feminists claim that women, all women, are oppressed by systematic institutionalized discrimination and socially accepted violence that keep the entire female population in a second-class role in comparison to men. This view is largely based on examining human rights issues and gender roles through a filter that reserves consideration for women and girls, but responsibility and accountability for men and boys. When consideration is given to men and boys, it is seen as being taken from women and girls, and when women and girls face personal responsibility and accountability, it is seen as discrimination against them. That has allowed feminists to treat conditions affecting both sexes as if they uniquely affect women and girls, portray women as victims of the results of their own choices, and articulate expectations of men that they would never tolerate should women be asked to live up to them. They have promoted this view of women's status in society through over 200 years of social evolution, during which women's roles in Western society have dramatically and profoundly changed. Instead of evolving their approach in tandem with these changes, feminists moved on to establish the female victim identity encapsulated in their patriarchy narrative. Improved conditions for women don't mean women are no longer oppressed now, because all objectionable conditions that affect women are said to be maliciously targeted on the basis of sex. This, in turn, allows them to inflate minor inconveniences or personal preference-based objections into the current version of crippling systematic institutionalized oppression. Manspreading and stare rape have taken their place alongside the historical conditions under coverture and the narrative on intimate partner and sexual violence. Under this model, there is no room for women to ever escape the victim identity, as every time a set of objections and demands are addressed and resolved, the new gender role and the next adversity level down will become the new maliciously gender-targeted, crippling, exploitative, patriarchal, systematic, institutionalized oppression of women and girls. That is the foundation of the scam. Step 2. Convince society to feel indebted to the underdog, enough to justify social change and funding for entitlements and service programs. During the 19th century and about the first two-thirds of the 20th century, feminism's objections centered on the restrictions and obligations women faced as a function of the overall female gender role in society, often described by modern feminists as women having been literally chattel. These objections ignored the fact that these conditions existed to facilitate men's responsibility for meeting their obligations to women and restrictions on their behavior around and involving women, which they faced as a function of the overall male gender role in society. Feminists did not ignore these conditions, but instead fought to free women from their side of that system while preserving everything about men's side of it that obligated them to serve, protect, defer to, and provide for women. Having achieved that, feminists spent the final third of the 20th century establishing the body of the scam based on the female victim identity. This entailed tailoring research to foster conclusions that would support that identity. An example of this is the research used to support feminism's rape culture narrative. During the 60s and 70s, feminists began promoting a set of beliefs about sexual violence prevalence and perpetrator demographics that were formed almost entirely on the basis of ideology. This would be the idea that male-perpetrated sexual violence committed against female victims is pervasive and normalized due to societal attitudes about gender and sexuality. During the 80s, academic feminists began seeking a means to support those beliefs by citing data. One of the obstacles they faced was the inconvenient fact that existing data didn't do that. Another was a stark disparity between feminist attitudes toward women's sexual experiences and women's own assessment of them. Feminists needed a method to get around those obstacles. A variety of data collection and creation methods were tried until feminist icon Gloria Steinem promoted the work of Kent State University professor Mary P. Koss, despite serious flaws in her method from a scientific standpoint. Koss's survey method, used to create a report that Steinem published in Ms. magazine, involved asking women vaguely worded questions about their experiences and then applying labels to them based on feminist dogma rather than the woman's own assessment. From the initial report's publication, Koss's method has been criticized for the disparity between researchers' assessment of women's answers and women's own assessment. Other criticisms include her application of the label rape to experiences which didn't legally constitute rape, Koss's choice to phrase her definition of rape to exclude female perpetration against male victims despite not using the legal definition of rape, and wording of the questions to avoid getting answers affected by personal agency. Those objections did not lead to reform or abandonment of those methods, however. Instead, Koss's work became the standard in feminist-informed sexual violence prevalence research, her methods eventually being adopted by government agencies. As we've pointed out before, Koss's survey questions and crime definitions are the basis for the Centers for Disease Control's National Intimate Partner in Sexual Violence Survey. The researchers who did that survey, at least the 2010 survey, did not even know why they were using a definition of rape that specified the victim must be penetrated and thereby excluded male victims on whom women had forced coitus or fellatio. This was demonstrated to me by the answers some of those researchers offered me during a conference call regarding the data from that survey, the audio from which is included at the end of Alison's video, Men's Rights versus Feminist Rape Culture, explained using puzzle pieces. When they're not relying on weasel wording and bypassing survey respondents' agency, feminists use House of Cards research methods wherein a small study using a carefully chosen sample is used to get desired results instead of accurate ones. Often dogma that hasn't been established as fact, but is widely accepted as such by feminists, may be used as the basis for supposed truths on which the research is based. This is its own House of Cards method, with writer A's personal beliefs cited as a source in person B's essay, which in turn is cited in person C's thesis until the woozle finds its way into acceptance as established fact. An example of this is the feminist toxic masculinity narrative. Feminist use of the term toxic masculinity emerged from writings on masculinity by Australian sociologist and arguably the founding mother of Australia's gender studies curriculum, Raewyn Connell. Prior to its first use, the components of its definition were established in Connell's 1985 paper, Theorizing Gender, which cites existing feminist theory, including role theory. In this paper, Connell lays the groundwork for attributing dysfunctional behavior in men to socially imposed gender roles and stereotypes, while this same dysfunction in women may not even be attributed to gender at all. Connell later began using the term hegemonic masculinity to denote a given culture's standard expectations of characteristics to be displayed by men and boys. The usage is based on the Marxist term cultural hegemony, which refers to a ruling class's imposition of its worldview as a social norm to dominate an otherwise culturally diverse society. The concept of hegemonic masculinity, derived from this belief, was used to establish social expectations of masculine characteristics as both a vehicle for and experience of male domination of women. The concept of toxic masculinity, derived from the idea of hegemonic masculinity, is used to frame dysfunctional characteristics or behavior as gender-specific and ultimately curable by feminizing men. It is significant that Connell's initial writings on masculinity, from which the toxic masculinity narrative stems, were penned prior to her public identification as a woman, when gender dysphoria would define her experience of masculinity, but would not be evident in her presentation of her ideas to the public. That she is a trans woman does not invalidate her experiences related to masculinity, but it does invalidate her claims that her work is applicable to the male population in general. It's interesting work on how stereotypical masculinity can feel like a prison to a person experiencing gender dysphoria, to the degree that even the truth behind the stereotype, men's psychological and emotional makeup being different from that of women, feels to the person experiencing dysphoria like it's a lie. But that doesn't make it a lie in terms of all men, and especially not in terms of straight cis men. It is also significant that Connell's assertions rise from supporting ideology with ideology, basing each new assertion on the assumption that those it follows are valid and widely applicable. This presumed knowledge is then cited as evidence for assertions taken as fact in the determination of hypothesis and methodology in research related to masculinity. It has even become the basis for determining the American Psychology Association's first ever guidelines for practice with men and boys. In other words, Rao and Connell's gender dysphoria and the ideological rhetoric inspired by it are now guiding factors that psychologists all over the United States will be expected to use in therapeutic environments intended to treat men and boys suffering other mental health conditions. Often, feminist writing and biased research are used to support conclusions that have no basis in fact and wrongly applied to the general population like this, but not so widely promoted. Instead, they're buried under layers of citation and essay with an end result in the form of a report from newer research that traces back to it. That is then widely promoted with the flaws at its roots shielded from public scrutiny by a trail of citations mostly hidden behind paywalls or in exclusive academic libraries. Double standards camouflaged by careful phrasing also serve to disguise biased design. For example, research on attitudes and reasoning behind partner violence perpetration might define aggression against a partner suspected of cheating on the relationship as coercive control stemming from a sense of ownership and entitlement when a man does it, but self-defense against feeling betrayed and disrespected when a woman does it. The first physical assault in a bidirectional conflict gets labeled an effort to dominate if a man is the aggressor, but preemptive self-defense if the aggressor is a woman. In this manner, researchers guided by ideology can create a body of data from which to draw conclusions that ignore women's agency and dysfunction while emphasizing men's agency and dysfunction. They can blame men for adverse conditions and experiences faced by both sexes and portray women as victims of everything. Once tailored research is established and put to use, its conclusions are exploited to create panic and call for action. In the late 80s and early 90s, this entailed a hard push for the Violence Against Women Act, a federal bill that amended existing law on intimate partner and sexual violence to presume perpetrators male and victims female, and tailor legal recourse, government services, and authoritative response to fit that frame. Included in VAWA was funding for a variety of feminist initiatives which would create jobs for women's studies graduates. When Joe Biden introduced and promoted the bill in 1993, he cited statistics based on Koss's work as evidence for why Congress should pass it, using women's victim identity as a combination battering ram and get-out-of-criticism-free card. It worked, with the bill being signed into law in 1994. This leads into Step 3. Profit as underdogs, self-appointed representatives, and service experts. Not only did VAWA gear jobs in the intimate partner and sexual violence victims advocacy industry toward feminist ideologues with gender studies degrees, it created new roles for them to fill. It funded ideology-based training for every aspect of the justice system, from the neighborhood patrol officer to judges and other court personnel. There had to be experts to administer that training. The law and its subsequent updates created a set of regulations and standards complicated enough to inspire a variety of types of organizations, from educational institutions to corporate entities, to pay consultants to inform them on their compliance needs and means of lawsuit prevention. There had to be experts to provide that consultation as well. The bulk of the human resources service industry employed by most big organizations exists to navigate the minefield created by this law, its subsequent updates, and the tweaking tendrils it has shot out into other federal law and policy. A human resources specialist can draw a salary similar to that of a school teacher. On top of the variety of profitable areas of expertise this has created, the victim identity itself nets big bucks for organizations purporting to advocate in women's name, with donations coming in from wealthy institutions like the Ford Foundation, major banks, political organizations, and government agencies, that last being largely through grants that trace back to feminist lobbied law and policy. The scam is supported by a cycle that begins with victim identity, continues with the tailored research, panic-mongering, and feminist lobby, and then follows up with rhetoric. When feminist lobby, law, and policy creates its own problems due to anti-male discrimination and funding of dysfunctional choices in women and girls, feminists deflect criticism with cries of misogyny or by labeling their critics oppressors. They treat criticism as evidence of a need for further research and so-called reform. Express doubt that we live in a rape culture and your criticism will be used as evidence of that environment. The act of questioning patriarchy theory is treated as a manifestation of patriarchy. Don't believe in toxic masculinity? That's just your own toxic masculinity speaking. But you're a woman, you say? You're just suffering from internalized misogyny, which in your case is a result of living in an environment dominated by toxic masculinity, of course. All roads lead back to the feminist victim identity and its male perpetrator boogeyman, where the cycle begins again with step 1, create underdog. The spinning will continue until the ridiculousness of the narrative exceeds society's level of tolerance for unfounded victim signaling. I only have one question. Are we there yet? Hello and welcome to HBR Talk 67, the Feminist Advocacy Research Scam. I'm your host, Hannah Wallen, here with that nonsense annihilator, Lauren B., and that adorable specter of death, Prim Reaper, to examine the phenomenon of feminists manufacturing ways to lie about their dogma. But first, I'm gonna nag you because I'm female and we women just do that. Come on, guys. Go to badgerfeed.com and register to receive notifications so you'll always know the who, what, where, when, and often the why of Honey Badger Radio. And if you want to support what we do, even in the midst of all of the financial blacklisting that is taking place today, feedthebadger.com is the site for that. Remember, Badger Feed for information and Feed the Badger to support our work, because we like to be confusing. Last thing, if you want the opportunity to nag everyone else into checking us out, don't forget to smash that like button and share us on every social media site you use, because that's basically the only way to get past all of that censorship. And speaking of silencing and manipulation, ladies, after consideration of feminism's research methodology, got any interesting conclusions?
Oh God, this topic is just personally infuriating to me for so many reasons.
Prepare for Prim Rage.
Well, I mean, I actually kind of did a video on the subject, or on a related subject not too long ago, that actually went over a topic that was just, I'll just read the title just for you guys. Internalized misogyny as a moderator of the link between sexist events and women's psychological distress.
A buzzword soup.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and the whole thing was just an entire article of these questionable research methods trying to come up with any number of ways that women face psychological distress as a result of their self-hatred. And just the methods that they used were just ridiculous. And at one point, let me see if I can find it. Yeah, they listed a number of scales to talk about internalized misogyny, and their reported alpha scores on the IMS were 88 or 0.88 full scale, 0.82 distrust of women subscale, 0.83 devaluing women subscale, and 0.74 valuing men subscale.
Oh
so
my gosh.
Apparently, just valuing men is enough to
or
qualify.
Distrusting women. You can't ever have a reason to distrust women. You can't have experiences that lead you to distrust women. Nope, if you distrust women, you have something wrong with you.
Yep.
Yeah, it's called the patriarchy.
Well, and I mean, like, even that, they were talking about, like, various things for internalized sexism and psychological distress, and they were using just the most vague terms to talk about these things. So basically, you feel a little bad, and it's evidence of internalized sexism or something. Like, it was a nonsense article.
Oh, geez.
Yeah.
Yeah,
This is common in feminist research.
See, that's the thing
say.
I ran into, and I was explaining to Prim before the show. This started me covering this topic started on Reddit. I think maybe 6 or 8 years ago. This title came from the title of an article on my blog, Breaking the Glasses, when I looked into feminist rape culture theory, because of an argument I had with a fellow MRA regarding the men's rights movement's objection to the idea of a rape culture, and talking about in specificity the idea that society tells women the way they dress triggers rapists into raping them. And there were some other things in that discussion, but I started digging into the research on which rape culture theory is based. And the more I dug into it, the more I found this process. First, they start with an assumption: women are oppressed, or rape is used as a means socially by all men to dominate all women. Something along those lines. Rape is common. The idea of interacting with each other contributes to the commission of rape in society, something like that. And then they base that as their truth on which the research is done. So we say, okay, well, we know this is true. Now, in light of this so-called truth, we are going to research this phenomenon that is parallel to this so-called truth, and then we'll draw conclusions about that phenomenon. And then the next thing cites that research as a basis for confirming that phenomenon, which isn't really confirmed because it's based on presuming something true that isn't proved. But they cite that, and they do some parallel thing, and that comes to another conclusion. And they'll have this whole series of research papers that all cite these previous conclusions that are drawn on false pretenses. And at some point, somebody will do a research paper where they'll state some type of belief, some dogma, some philosophy, and they'll cite all of this fake research as the basis for that belief. And then something else will be done with that belief being stated. This is the truth on which we are basing our research, and this is the parallel phenomenon we're researching based on accepting this other thing as true. And that becomes the thing that they use to lobby for law and policy changes.
Well, and then plus on top of that, they get to go ahead and say, oh, look, we have all this peer-reviewed research to support our claims. Where's your peer-reviewed research? Oh, wait, I mean, it couldn't get accepted, so it doesn't exist. Yeah. Oh, that's tough luck for you. It looks like you can't write any papers that support your ideas.
Yeah, and you have... The peer review process is, oh, a feminist wrote this. Rubber stamp.
Yeah, exactly.
Are you there, Lauren?
I'm here. I was going to say, I mean, we kind of got a little bit past it, but it's like they start with a conclusion and then they work backwards to try to find the answers, like if you've ever taken a math test and they say, well, find the answer, but explain how you got there. They just grab shit from anywhere and say, okay, well, but the answer is right, so therefore everything else is right, and it doesn't work that way.
Yeah, there's one that's really blatant, and they do a neat trick with it. They conclude that there is sexism in hiring, that there's gender differences in hiring that are on the basis of sexism, and what was it? It was assistants to department heads or something like that in universities, in the areas, the sciences areas. And so they they went with, they sent resumes, one each, to department heads of a variety of departments in a variety of universities and all over the place. And so each department head got one resume. Some of them got male resumes, and some of them got female resumes. Same resume, same exact credentials and everything, male name on some, female name on the other. But they didn't factor in, am I sending this to a social sciences department? Am I sending this to a hard sciences department? Am I sending this to a school that has 700 students? Am I sending this to a school that has 5,000 students, or 10,000 students, and so on? Like, they didn't factor in any of that. They didn't factor in whether the departments they were sending them to had high pay, low pay, lots of responsibilities, minor responsibilities, any of that, whether the jobs were identical or anything. And then they looked at a pattern of the females not getting offered as much or not getting hired in some departments and everything as this is discrimination. And it's obviously because of discrimination, because it affected the females differently than the males. Except they have no way of knowing what the reasoning behind the choice was on the whether the individual got the job or not, or got offered an amount or not, because they didn't determine whether or not these resumes were sent to schools with the same pay offers and sent to schools with the same hiring pool. Maybe they had 10,000 students at their school versus 700 that a guy was sent to, and instead of competing with 5 applicants, the female resume was competing with 500 applicants. So like all of that was ignored, and the conclusion: sexism.
Wow, that sounds like sound logic.
Yeah, they did the same thing with race and jobs out in the real world. And we only send one resume, so we don't have to examine, the motivations behind the individual. But this is exactly what feminism has done all this time. And you look at this, and you have these things are done. Then they're cited, then they go on to the next and the next, and that stack goes through, and then they're going in and stating to Congress or your state representatives, or lobbying through letter writing to a department like the education department. We have to have policy that addresses this thing that we found, and here's the research that shows the thing that we found, and they show them the top layer, and they get the Violence Against Women Act, or they get the Dear Colleague letter, or they get policy on workplace harassment and stuff like that.
Right. I mean, there was actually kind of a similar kind of related situation that actually happened. I just got this today, so it's actually kind of interesting. As I'd mentioned way back before, Cafe in Calgary is trying to open up their Center for Men and Families, right? And it's going really well. We're doing really well in funding. And right now I'm trying to get the organization listed with the 211 database, so that way it can actually be referred to men who need those services. But I was just talking with Toronto Cafe about how they were trying to get their center in Toronto 211, and like it initially seemed like a success because everybody was very supportive of the idea that yes, men need help. But then all it took was one SJW individual out of the entire organization to basically not quite sabotage, but do everything in her power to try and sabotage that agency from being basically promoted by 211 in the area. So now, despite them being listed in the 211 database, they just don't seem to be being promoted to people who call into that resource anymore. So it's kind of amazing how it can just take one individual complaining about how anything to do with men, even something as innocuous as like a counseling service for men, is alt-right and misogynistic, and then all of a sudden it's just completely gone.
So it's in the database, but they're not telling people it's there.
Yeah, or they're not referring it nearly as often as would be expected.
And they're probably doing the same thing that they were doing before. Then, when men call in with abuse situations where they are experiencing abuse at the hands of a female partner, they're probably getting referred to anger management programs and other perpetrator programs.
Yeah, that happens a lot. In the literature review that I had just done on the subject, that was one of the most common occurrences that I had seen in a lot of the research talking about it. Fortunately, with the help of several people in the HBR Discord, I did manage to find a lot of research talking about male victims of domestic violence. But yeah, a lot of their problems right now is the not being supported by the resources, being referred to inappropriate resources, being blamed for what they're going through, or being assumed to be the perpetrator. And it's really messed up at just how this ideology can cause so many problems for men in so many different ways.
And they just don't care. They just don't care. I mean, how heartless of a person do you have to be to like just men need something? Fuck them. Yeah. Let's not show them or tell them where they can go to get the help that they need. But if it was a woman, you know, they would bend over backwards to try to find the services for her.
Oh yeah,
it's just.
It's even worse. It's if we acknowledge that this happens to men and that it has similar causes to when it happens to women. If we acknowledge men can be victims of this, and worse, that women can be perpetrators, we lose something very important in our advocacy as feminists. Like that's their thing. They lose the key that they use to fundraise. They fundraise specifically on the female victim identity. Well, if women's identity is not victim and men's identity is not perpetrator, then that fundraising key is gone. Their meal ticket is gone. And this is another area where that house of cards exists. Like they base their assertions regarding male victims and their reasoning behind referring male victims to perpetrator programs rather than victim programs most of the time. They base that on the Duluth model. Well, the Duluth model, not only has it been discredited by a significant amount of research that has been systematically suppressed by feminist academia, it actually has been discredited by one of its own creators. The individual who contributed to it, Ellen Pence, she was one of the sort of the writers of the Duluth model, one of the originators of the Duluth model, and she actually wrote, by determining that the need or desire for power was the motivating force behind battering, we created a conceptual framework that in fact did not fit with the lived experience of many of the men and women we were working with. I found that many of the men I interviewed did not seem to articulate a desire for power over a partner. Although I relentlessly took every opportunity to point out to the men in the groups that they were so motivated and merely in denial, the fact that few men ever articulated such a desire went unnoticed by me and many of my coworkers. Eventually, we realized that we were finding what we had predetermined to find. Like, that is feminist research right there in a nutshell.
Yeah.
How fucked up is that? Like, that you can just sit there and just keep repeating that to these people who are not saying anything of the sort. And it's like, no, you're motivated by power, and if you're not saying that, well, that's obviously you're just trying to hide it. It's not that you don't feel those things. It's just that you're doing something malicious. Somewhere in there, you're doing something malicious.
Yeah. And I mean, this is exactly the same thing that Mary P. Koss did with women who she accused of being rape victims, and I say accused because they denied it. I mean, it's kind of an accusation if you're telling someone you are a victim of this and you are in denial. And men whose victimhood she denied when they had experienced the same things that she was calling rape when a woman experienced it. And like her methodology was so messed up. It wasn't just that in the 80s when she was doing this that she used definitions that didn't fit the legal definition of rape. If the legal definition of rape needed reform to include other forms of profound sexual intimacy, like we think of it basically the FBI definition and most of the legal definitions were things like carnal knowledge of a woman without her consent or against her will was more often used. And so, the law basically recognized that it was a crime of intent, and against your will basically determines that it's a crime when the perpetrator attempts to contravene your refusal. And when they turn it around to without your consent, it becomes a crime if the perpetrator doesn't ask enough, right? And doesn't get the right messages from you and moves forward anyway. But the reform that's valid is coming along and saying, well, this can be true whether it's coitus, fellatio, cunnilingus. It doesn't matter if it's anal. It doesn't matter. It's still rape. That's valid. It's also valid to say whether the perpetrator is male or female. Koss worked very hard to avoid that last bit. Like, she worked very hard to avoid saying, yeah, it's also rape when a woman does it, and it's also rape when it happens to a man. Because she really did not want to call it rape when a woman does it to a man. And so she looked to expand the definition from intent to accident without capturing perpetration by women. And I think a large part of that is because expanding the definition from intent to accident would capture the fact that the vast majority of women never take their guys' feelings into consideration when they pursue sexual intimacy. And they don't when they pursue anything social. Like I booked us to go to this party with these people that you don't know. We're gonna hang out there all night. I hope you have something that is clean to wear, and whatever. Don't wear that shirt. That kind of they just completely run over their guys, and I think Koss knew that, and that was why she didn't want to capture data on women running roughshod over men's agency and over men's objections, or even not even bothering to find out if they have objections, which is what she has chosen to try to get criminalized. And all the research on sexual violence that is used to promote the idea of a rape culture in the West, and a large portion of what's used to promote the idea of a rape culture in places like India and even the Middle East, use those definitions. So we're looking at a worldwide application of everything a guy does is rape if he isn't playing basically Simon Says with the woman involved. But nothing a woman does is raped, even if she's actually using force or coercion.
Right. And I mean, I think that there's a lot of that goes on that, it's just not really thinking about women's motivations or thinking of them differently. Like when a man, wants to have sex with a woman in his apartment or whatever, and she doesn't feel like it, then he's predatory for wanting that. But if a woman has a guy over at her apartment and she wants sex and he doesn't, well, I mean, obviously he's just gay.
Yeah, or worse, he's being abusive because he's denying her. He went in there and now he's denying her, right? That's another one I've been told. Oh, you're mean, you're abusive, you're making her feel unattractive. What's wrong with you? How dare you treat a woman like that?
Yeah, exactly. Of course, I don't want to like go too hard into like being that it's always going to be women who are necessarily putting forth the feminist ideology too at the same time. Like I just went back over the email that I'd mentioned from earlier, and I just want to make it clear, I might have said it was a woman, but that was mistaken of me. It was a guy that shut down the 211 thing. It was a guy who was being SJW. So it's definitely men who can also do these things. It's not just men versus women or women versus men. It's this ideology that gets into whatever it wants to, and it poisons the things that it touches. So
yeah, there are some ways that men can be better at being SJWs than women can. There's some ways that women can be better at it than men. Women are better at the victim narrative to a degree. Men are better at authoritative social justice warrioring. You will do this because it is right, because I said so, and I'm a social justice warrior, and I am on the right side of this argument, so I'm shutting you down.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like the line here is he had prepared a long report quoting some internet sources critical of one of our gala speakers, Warren Farrell, and declaring our organization to be alt-right and misogynistic. So he went and prepared a report on this. So your description is incredibly accurate.
Yeah, that's not surprising. And Warren Farrell is one of the most rational and most compassionate people I've met. I mean, he looks into human conditions and human interactions from a standpoint of how can we help people reach the best possible outcomes. And because he has examined some very hard things to examine in the process of that, like basically you go through abuse situations and you go through very dysfunctional family situations. You can't just say, well, this is wrong and we have to stop it. You have to look at why it's happening. Because if you think you're going to stop it without knowing why it's happening, you're wrong. You just aren't going to stop it. You're going to, put your foot down, and the dysfunction is going to be like, I'm going to keep happening right here in front of you. And so he goes through and he looks at some very difficult things to examine. Feminists turn around and accuse him of promoting them as good things, which is not the case. And the other thing is that he's been misquoted. And I believe it was an interview he did for Penthouse magazine. The writer attributed a statement to him that he says he has never made, and the writer has never offered any evidence that he actually did. The writer just stands by, no, this is true. He said this. So there's no, it's a he said. I believe it was a male writer, a he said thing, and feminists latched onto that and decided to believe the Penthouse magazine writer over the man he was quoting regarding what the man he was quoting said, with no evidence other than the writer's word that that's what was said. And when I've done reporting where I've done an interview and asked people questions and gotten their responses, and then written an article based on the responses I got and everything. And if you don't have a recording and you don't have written notes, you don't have an exact quote. And if you do have written notes and it's just your shorthand and not an exact quote written down that the person said, you don't have any evidence that they said what you're claiming they said. In fact, and I don't do it very much anymore, but if I do an interview and then write a news article or a report or something based on that interview, I record the interview so that I have the exact words. And the reason I do it is because I don't want to put somebody in a situation like Dr. Farrell was put in by this writer. And I don't want to put myself in a situation like this writer was put in. This writer may have interpreted something that Dr. Farrell said to mean what the writer quoted him as saying, and he may be wrong. And he may be adamantly wrong. He may really strongly believe that he's right. And Dr. Farrell may have said something very rational and important to pay attention to that the guy missed and wrote this quote instead. And so he didn't get his point across because he wasn't recorded. And like that's not the only he's not the only person that Penthouse has done this to. There's a feminist that gets quoted by Penthouse that I never use the quote because she has said the same thing. That is not what I said. He's misquoting me. And it's to do with something about half of rape allegations being false. It's a handy quote if you want to believe it, but without solid evidence that it's a real quote. And with Penthouse having, we know that Dr. Farrell has contested a quote Penthouse made of him. I can't very well call Penthouse a good source on contested quotes, right? You can't say, well, just because she's contesting it. This is one of those situations, and yet you have one male social justice warrior acting authoritatively and using the controversy over Dr. Farrell's work as his basis. And that's all it takes to shut down promotion of a resource for abused men.
Mm-hmm.
What a scam.
It's pretty fucked up, right? Like, I just hope that we don't run into anything like that in doing the same here. That would be just awful.
Yeah. I think what's going to end up having to happen is if that's going on with these resources, it's going to be up to the men's rights movement to promote those resources for men. They need to become so well known that you don't have to call the central hotline to find them. Your information is out there. We'll have to talk about a way to do that, but perhaps we'll have to at some point fundraise for a billboard campaign or something, so that men in the community get that information regardless of the social justice warriors' control over the system.
Yeah, that would be fantastic.
Yeah.
This is actually, I'd be willing to do a fundraising stream for something like that. And in fact, we can plan it later. But yeah, get the information, find out what it's going to cost, or have somebody in the group find out what it's going to cost, and we'll come up with a stream topic and a day that we can do it in the next month or so. And I'm game. That pisses
awesome.
me off so bad.
I know, right?
I had a friend this is one of the reasons I went into men's rights activists. I had a friend when I was in college. This would be clear back in early 90s, like 92, 91, 92, 93, who was married to a woman who had been a high school athlete. She was 6 feet tall, broad shoulders. Like, I wouldn't have wanted to piss her off myself. She'd get mad at him over something, and she would grab small appliances, cookware, knickknacks from the shelves in their house, even like a floor lamp. At one point, she picked up a 5-foot-tall floor lamp and threw it across the room at him in front of me. And it just, Jesus. I was like, what the hell? You're gonna hurt him. You may be mad, because he said he was going to do something and he didn't do it. He said he was going to do something and he didn't do it. Well, married people do that sometimes. You say, I'm going to get the dishes done today, and then, your boss calls and you have to go over something about work, or your cousin from out of state calls and you find out that your second cousin died, and you talk about that for 2 hours, and then you don't get the dishes done. And, that's not, you don't throw a lamp at somebody because they didn't get the dishes done, right? You say, okay, I understand. And if it's a consistent problem, then you talk about, hey, you're making things really rough for me. Can we work something out? But there wasn't any place. People would laugh when I say, yeah, she's throwing things at him. Oh, that's so funny. It's like comedy on television. No, it's not. What if it hits him in the head? What if she throws the iron skillet?
You got extra lean beef. This was supposed to be lean beef.
Yeah. It is like, and her temper, so her temper was comical, but not for that reason. For people who have seen Singing in the Rain, the bitchy lady, I can't think of her name. She had this really high-pitched soprano voice, and she had this really ridiculous hick accent, like a gangster mall accent. Well, the gangster mall accent wasn't there, but it sounded like this Amazon had breathed helium when she would yell. She would get mad,
gosh.
you know. I can't believe you did that! I'm gonna kick your ass! And she'd be throwing things. So it was that was funny, but the throwing things was not funny. And like when you were in the situation, the reality of it was rather terrifying. Because this is this big strong woman. She wasn't you know, and it's not that a woman who's, you know, 5'2", is gonna be any less dangerous if she picks up a 2-pound knick-knack and throws it at your head. It's, you know, it's like getting a shot put from the junior high thrown at you. You know, that's dangerous.
Yeah.
But to look at this as, you know, giving men a place to go, the idea of giving men a place to go where they can get out and they can be safe from that type of abuse. If they're in that situation, that they can call somebody and say, I gotta get out of the house. She's going to kill me. That treating that as an attack on women, it's almost, it's the same as treating beating men as a female entitlement. Does she have the right to engage in that behavior? Does she have the right to throw things at him? Does she have the right to hurt him physically? Does she have the right to injure him? Does she have the right to brain him? Because that was where it was headed. And unfortunately for him, she also wasn't loyal, and they eventually got divorced. But and I say fortunately for him, because that kind of violence, a lot of times, once you get accustomed to engaging in that kind of violence against another person, you relax and you start to escalate. Especially women. You know, that it worked, and then, you know, he becomes accustomed to dodging things, so you find heavier things or you throw bigger things and so on. But yeah, it really pisses me off, the idea that there's a resource. Feminists have spent the last 10 years accusing men's rights activists of not giving a shit about men and only complaining about the issues and never doing anything to actually create a resource for men. And now there's a resource created for men, and because the organization that created it had a speaker who analyzes why bad things happen in interpersonal relationships and examines the difficult questions regarding that, this one social justice warrior wants to torpedo the entire thing. I don't usually get into this, but shame on him, honestly.
Yeah, that's for fucking sure. And you know, like you can even turn it around, and you can kind of use their language too when talking about these kinds of issues, because like people who like to make jokes about female perpetrators of domestic violence, or say things like, oh, what did he do to make her so angry, or oh, you're gonna get it now, ha ha ha. It's funny. It's like, okay, aren't you the people that like to say that women are as strong as men, and that women are super powerful? And it's like, you know, you're being kind of patronizing right now if you think about it. Are women equally as strong and capable as men, like you say, or are you saying that women are weak and helpless and they can't actually do any harm? Because, you know, you can't have it both ways. Either way, you're being a shithead.
No, yeah. Well, you think about that. On one hand, you have feminists claiming that all pay disparity is gender-based. That, you know, all disparity between men and women is not gender-based, but discrimination-based. And women do the same work as men all the time at the same jobs. And women women not only do the same work, but do the same quality, do the same amount, work the same hours, and so on. That's the claim that's behind the wage gap myth, and that women are capable of having the same aptitudes, not just attitudes, but aptitudes in the workplace, and the same capabilities, the same strengths, and the same performance. But at the same time, despite the fact that there are a lot of heavy and hard labor jobs, a lot of dirty jobs, a lot of uncomfortable jobs that pay a lot of money that not a lot of women go into, those are the areas that women are equal to men, right? But when you have a situation of abuse, suddenly, getting stabbed by a woman is less harmful than getting stabbed by a man because women are weak.
Yeah, it's pretty pathetic, really. Like, it's whatever they can do to make it most convenient for them all the time, and nobody ever, well, I mean, other than us, I guess, not enough people call them out on this shit.
Yeah.
Hey, Lauren, you got to start elbowing in on us.
I know. I'm trying to navigate my internet, like going in and out. So, I don't want to get caught mid sentence. But yeah, just the idea that I can't take a hit or be violent. I'm sorry. I get just as angry as anybody else. I can be violent if I'm pushed far enough, so don't tell me that I can't take a punch, because I damn sure can throw one, and if I do, I expect to get hit back. That's how it goes. You can't just sit in a corner throwing rocks at the world and not expect to get shit thrown back at you.
Exactly. Like, you can't swing your fist and then all of a sudden, when the fists start getting swung back at you, proclaim, "Oh, but I'm a lady, though."
Right.
It's so ladylike, such ladylike behavior, throwing things at people. Okay, so I'm going to catch up a little bit on we have a lot of super chats, so we're doing, and I don't have a bot to read them for me, so I will read them myself as the super chat bot. But since I don't have quite the same capability here, it'll just sound like me. French Honey Badger gave us $5 and said the ideological financing of VAWA should be an indicator to skeptics, trademark, that the state is one of the enemies against us in the current Patreon war. And that's a really good point. One thing people don't realize was that there was a lot of feminist money that went into promoting the Violence Against Women Act before it got passed. Like, our listeners know that prior to the Violence Against Women Act, there was the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act of 1984 that was gender neutral, funded shelters, funded hotlines, guided police to, look at it. Assault doesn't become not assault because the husband or wife did it to the other partner. Those things were all established in law already when VAWA was passed. What VAWA did was gender it and basically fund Duluth model training for all of the levels of the justice system. And then it started funding advocates for accusers against their accused in the court system. So, and it funded research too. Now that this is another feminist advocacy research scam area. The Violence Against Women Act funds research to be done at Duluth model guided women-only victims shelters, domestic violence victim shelters. And from that research, they have determined that domestic violence is almost entirely male perpetrated against female victims. I'm not sure how they came to that conclusion.
That's so weird.
Yeah.
I think it.
And then we have Master Rogue gave us $2 and said, Prim! Huggy face, heart, smiley face. I missed you. Heart. with sparkles.
I miss being here.
Yeah, well, I think we all like. It's great to have you on here because a lot of times your perspective on stuff is specifically clinical at the right time and in the right way, especially on a topic like this.
Yeah, so. This was a good night for this. There's so much to rage about.
I know. We have General Jack Ripper gave us $10 and said, there is a YouTuber by the name of King Crocoduck who was making a video series called The Science Wars, which might be good watching for anyone interested. It's relevant to the topic at hand. And I think that's good. I've seen some of King Crocoduck's stuff. It's been a while, and I really probably need to get back to his channel and look again. But yeah, this definitely sounds relevant to this topic. And this is something that, like, you see this in this. You'll see this also in other victim identity politics based research. You see it in research on racism. You'll see it in research on discrimination against the non-religious versus the religious. It's very sneaky, and a lot of the social sciences is rife with this kind of crap. So I'm sure he probably has some relevant information, and he's probably touched on some things that we haven't because of that. This really hits a large area of research. Hokey Bukisa gave us $1.99 and said, oh, and also, we're the same. Upside down, smiley face. Tyler Preston gave us $5 and said, feminists always double down on everything. Like with the wage gap, by saying women choose low-paying jobs because of society's influence, etc. And yeah, I love that one. Your employer is now responsible for your choice to move your parents into your home with you and become their caregiver. And the fact that you chose part-time work instead of full-time work so you'd have more time to take care of your children when they were growing up, that's your employer's fault. And it's discrimination that they are not paying you a full-time salary for that part-time work. That's feminism in a nutshell.
God damn. How do they expect this stuff to be tenable? It doesn't even make sense.
Yeah, I know. It blows my mind that they can make these arguments and actually be taken seriously. When there's other stuff like that, you hear. I always talk about the ridiculousness of the articles or the arguments. I mean, that come out of the forums that pedos come crawling out of when they want to engage in pedo acceptance advocacy, right? And they have these arguments that they've worked out with each other in their little forums where they think they have come up with something very clever, and then they say it in the real world and everybody's like, no, and gives them an explanation as to why it's stupid. Feminists do the same exact thing, and people are like, oh, that's gold, let's adopt it and promote it, and we'll make a big media campaign based on it, and billboards and videos and commercials, and nobody but the men's rights movement calls them on it. And then the men's rights movement gets called misogynistic for saying so.
Yep. There's no winning this one.
Well, eventually, because now we're getting to the point where it's hitting the mainstream. We're seeing, at the very least, right now, it's hitting conservatives because we have the sort of the underlying power is on the progressive end of the left. And then to a degree, it's also hitting the left because the liberal end of the left is being run over by the progressive end of the left. And they are using gynocentrism, they are using demonization of men, they are using Me Too to do it. So there's a significant portion of the population now that's getting hit with this, and they're starting to wake up to it. They'll eventually start not being able to put up. That's why I say eventually we're going to hit that point where society's tolerance for this bullshit runs out. Then we have, I'm going to go on with the next super chat here. I lost my place. There it is. Siri de Flora gave us $10 and said, I've had to take many breaks from reading abusive moms. So many use grooming behaviors that keep their adult children in emotional or physical, covert or overt incestual relationships to control them. I'm assuming Abusive Moms is a book, or an article, but
maybe just stories about them in general.
Yeah. But you are right. I have noticed in just people I've talked to who have been abused by their parents, those that are abused by their moms create these codependent relationships with them. You can't live without me. You can't survive in the world without me. Everything you do out of my control is wrong and harmful to you. It's very much like what was described in oh shit, I can't think of the song. It's Pink Floyd's song.
I'm really bad with song titles.
It's the freaking title of their movie. You guys, I'm sleep deprived today, so The Wall. But yeah, where he goes through and starts having a conversation with his mom in the song. And I'm not going to go through and start quoting large swatches of the song or anything, but it's back and forth about, what's going to happen to me, what should I do, how should I live in the world, and it's, mama's going to take care of everything. That behavior is very common in relationships and family relationships where the mother is the abuser, male and female. Where whether it's boys or girls that the mother has been abusing, and I guess it's probably due to the differences in sort of toxicity or dysfunction between men and women. I think women are more likely to go into that borderline narcissistic, I must be the most important thing in your world kind of attitude when they are in an abusive degree of dysfunction. But Hoki Bukisa goes on with $4.99. It says, how to fix domestic violence. Make reciprocating domestic violence legal. That'd nip it in the bud. Yeah, I've kind of said something like that myself, because 70% of domestic violence is actually initiated by women. And if you look at statistics on domestic violence, the group that has the smallest tendency to engage in it is gay men. And I think the reason is because of a combination of two things. One, when you hit somebody of the same sex, you know they can hit you back. Right? You know that you are in for it. And the other end of it is when a man hits another man, as opposed to when a woman hits another woman, he is taking a significant chance that he is hitting somebody who knows how to fight, because he grew up getting in fights, and it was condoned because he was a boy. So he doesn't just have the risk of getting hit back, he has the risk of getting hit back effectively. And when that happens, he learns, don't hit my boyfriend because he's going to knock me on my ass. For some reason, lesbians are the opposite. Lesbians, they hit each other all the time. And a neat scholar wants to know which study claimed that. That information came out of the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence surveys done by the Centers for Disease Control. There is other research that has confirmed it, but that is the most widely available piece of research that demonstrated it. And what it demonstrated was that the largest group of perpetrators per capita was lesbians. The smallest group of perpetrators per capita was gay men. And in terms of sexual violence, you had something very similar. Lesbians were more sexually violent than straight or gay men. And bisexual women were the most targeted. So apparently, lesbians are dangerous. No, but yeah, there's more likely that lesbians, when they engage in violence against other women, face not enough consequences for there to be a deterring factor from the consequences they face.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I wonder to what extent that might be, because young girls growing up, they might it might be seen as less of a thing when, like, they get into a cat fight and maybe slap another girl or whatever. Nobody's gonna be as likely to say, oh, don't do that, you're getting in trouble for fighting. Whereas I don't know, I see a lot of the negativity targeted towards when boys fight. It's like, oh, you're both suspended for fighting, blah blah.
Yeah. Well, there's another thing. There's other aspects too. This is something that we could go over in a full show, but I think there's one of the things that strikes me with, no pun intended, the differences between the ways boys deal with the aftermath of a fight and the way girls deal with the aftermath of a fight. The one who loses, picks himself up, he dusts himself off, and he moves on. He tries to minimize the perception that he's been defeated and damaged and dominated. So he minimizes his injury and strives to get over it. Boys will get along with each other after they have had a fight. They've established sort of a not necessarily a pecking order, but they've established a degree of, if not respect for character, respect for capability. And who has some authority based on that. And that sort of settles things, right? So then they move on. Girls, when they get into a fight, you get that codependent thing going on. Girls victim signal after they've had the shit kicked out of them. They don't, they don't minimize the damage. They don't minimize their suffering. They don't minimize other people's perception of their defeat. They whine about it to everyone. This person was mean to me. I just had my, and the other girl, if they are close and they have had a fight, the other girl has this massive, not necessarily guilt trip, but gets treated as if it's on her to nurture the losing fighter. So if you get a couple of lesbians who have a two-directional domestic violence relationship, or even a one-directional domestic violence relationship, you're going to have a different honeymoon period. And that honeymoon period can be addictive because there's a level of attention that you get from a person who is nurturing you out of guilt that you don't get anywhere else. And so that's extremely, and I'm betting that there is almost nobody out there who addresses that kind of cycle and that kind of issue behind a violence cycle in lesbian relationships. So they're not going to get stopped. They're not going to get shut down. And I
think it's really telling that the fact that feminists, you don't hear them talking about the results of that study, that lesbian relationships are the most violent. You would think that if feminists are so concerned about women and abuse towards women, why would you not then highlight this fact and talk about it and say something about it? But it's because you can't be seen as an aggressor and also a victim at the same time. It ruins the narrative.
Yeah, it really does. And nope, their biggest things that they emphasize out of that series of studies is the idea that 1 in 4 or 5 women in the world is raped. Like, they make a big deal about that, and they claim that this shows a high prevalence of perpetration among men, which it doesn't. They're treating it, when they promote that data, they're treating it as for every female that has been designated as a rape victim by this study, which there are women whose described experiences are not necessarily as these researchers have defined them. But for every woman they define as rape, they assume that there is a separate man out there or boy out there that has committed a rape. And the reality is, other research shows that it's like 10% or less of the male population, and the majority of perpetrators of sexual violence also perpetrate other forms of violence. So it's a violent subset of the population that already engages in trespass against people's boundaries in terms of, I want your stuff. And I want your job, or I don't like that you live in my neighborhood, things like that. They're the ones that are engaging in this kind of sexual violence, and that's not being addressed either. They want to generalize it to all men, so they don't look at that information, and they don't take that information into consideration in this kind of a study. And when they portray the results, when they state their conclusions, their stated conclusions are presented in such a way as to make it look like there's an epidemic of evil, rapey men out there going around running roughshod over women's boundaries, and nothing is happening in the reverse, even though the study found near parity in the experience of being, essentially, of having coitus or perpetrator performed oral sex, or having oral sex forced on you, between men and women, between male and female respondents. The fact that nearly half of respondents who experienced that were male never gets reported by the feminist majority that's promoting changes in law and policy based on these elements of research. So let's see. Hokibuhisa gave us another $4.99 and said, guys, I have an idea. Get this. Cutting baby dicks. Great, right? Oh, I've been in a long argument on Twitter about that.
I think I saw that one.
Oh,
was that the one
God.
where the person said, you don't have to use such terrible language to describe it?
Don't describe the actual process that is used. Don't describe what's actually done during a circumcision. Use the word circumcision because that sounds better. You're being manipulative if you actually describe what's really happening during a circumcision. Telling people the truth is manipulative, guys. Don't do it.
Wow, talk about missing the point.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh my God. Yeah, I've been. And I had a lot of fun with that guy because I got him to the point where he started repeating the same circle of arguments over and over and over again. I've posted some screenshots from that argument where this person made some really ridiculous arguments. And so if you go through not the tweets and responses or whatever, but the main part of my Twitter feed, you have to scroll back a little bit. You'll see, like, some of the shit this guy said was really dumb. But anyway, there's that. And we have this. I keep looking at this, and I'm not sure if I'm reading it right, but Syria Flora, I hope I'm saying it right, gave us $5 and said, sorry, asterisks about abusive moms. There is a support sub on Reddit I lurk on. Oh, okay, so there's a support subreddit for people who have abusive moms. That's interesting. Great community, but much feminism sometimes depends on the poster. Yeah, I could see that. When Reddit was a baby, nice itty bitty little baby sub, or itty little baby a social network where most of the subreddits, like the really big subreddits, had maybe 20 or 30,000 people in them, and the men's rights subreddit had 3,000. I noticed that there were already like 10 or 12 feminist subreddits. They are like roaches. They come in, and the next thing you know, they are everywhere. And already, feminists were trying to come in and control the men's rights subreddit. Like, they would show up, and they would post. There was one that I responded to by calling the person Nurse Ratchet, because all she did was write a post about, what would your mothers think if they knew what you were doing in here?
Oh my God.
Without citing any of the things that we did in the sub. Like, we talked about male suicide, and we talked about fathers' rights and the importance of family unity and stuff. What would your mother think if she saw you talking about family unity? She'd agree with me. She and my dad are in their 70s, and they're married. They've been married since 1968 or 69, somewhere in there. They were married. Let's see, it would be 68 because I was born in 72. So they've been married a very long time.
Well, I mean, Jesus Christ! Even my own mother, who's let half the town run a train, She said that it was fucked up, the idea of children being taken away from their fathers and not being allowed to see them anymore. So even my mom is saying that. So yeah, she'd probably be pretty okay with it.
Yeah, like Nurse Ratchet comes into the sub. What would your mother think of what you're doing in here?
my response is always, my mother doesn't pay my bills, so I don't give a shit.
There's a good answer for you. My mom's as much of a busybody as I am, though. Like that's kind of where I learned it. My mother and my grandmother. I come from a long line of busybodies who don't sit there and turn away when shitty things are being done to people and people are facing rotten circumstances. If there's something that we can do, we do. And that's just, I don't know how else to live. So that's, but that was fun. But that's the way Reddit's always been. It's always had this, this contingent of like feminist roaches. Not to disparage the individuals who believe in feminism as non-human, but the comparison is it's just impossible to not make. It's like roaches or bed bugs or whatever. They come in and do not have any sense of boundaries whatsoever in between themselves and your individuality in that environment, and your right to be yourself in that environment and engage with other people in a way that you and the person you're engaging with are in control of, and not the feminist to the side. And they will leave no area untouched. They will leave no area out of their control. And they will pester and pester and pester. They're still pestering the men's rights subreddit. I just responded to a post yesterday. I haven't been there in 8 months. I come back and there's the first thing I see actually is a post castigating the men of the sub for responding to a controversial issue without just accepting the feminist narrative on the woman involved in the issue, where they've actually questioned some of the assertions being made about the particular news story. And nobody's going to take you guys seriously, and nobody's going to like you if you don't take this kind of attitude towards women's issues, and this is an example, and it's like the worst example they could have given. So it's never going to stop. We're always going to have this. It's not so much a boogeyman, but not the other side of the coin either. Just there's always going to be nagging women, I guess you could say. That's the only way I can put it. There's always going to be nagging women that want control over men's boundaries, that are never going to accept men's control over the men's issues dialogue, and they're never going to accept women supporting men's boundaries, men's right to determine their own boundaries. So we're always going to see this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But that's all the super chats, and the one thing I wanted to get back to before we take off on this, I had mentioned this. This is something that I think, Prim, you're planning on expanding on it in another show, so I only want to talk about it a little bit here. But we're constantly told about toxic masculinity. We're constantly told that men's issues are a result of toxic masculinity. And I brought this up in my monologue, and I have citations for it in the Patreon post that is linked in the transcript for the opening monologue link. If you scroll down to the bottom of the text of the opening monologue, you'll see a whole set of links there. So Raelyn Connell, before she publicly identified as a man, began writing about masculinity and studying masculinity. I'm sorry, before she identified as publicly as a woman, when she still identified publicly as a man, and she was a biological man. She started writing about masculinity and issues surrounding masculinity. And one of the things that I identified when I started researching the toxic masculinity narrative because of how it was being used to dismiss men's issues and blame them on men. One of the things I found was that her writing reflected the attitudes that are described in Andrea Dworkin's writing on men. And I started to consider this, and it really clicked for me when I learned about the transition. But here you have an individual who is in the dawning of her gender dysphoria. It's trapped in the perception of a gender that she doesn't identify with, surrounded by people probably pushing her to be manlier because she was presenting as a feminine man. And I hope, I don't know if you guys can hear the background noise or not, but I got a low flying helicopter going by here that's really loud. I can feel it in my chest. Wow. Sorry. That, like, I haven't heard one go by that low in so long. Anyway, so Ray O'Connell is going through this experience while writing this stuff. And apparently is, at least to a degree, a student of Andrea Dworkin's work. And we always get told, don't mention Andrea Dworkin when you're talking about feminism. She isn't representative of feminism. Well, if Ray O'Connell's work, it doesn't necessarily cite Dworkin. But if it says the same things, maybe in a little more genteel manner, as Dworkin says, and it took place during a time period when she may have been experiencing masculinity as essentially a prison. That really undermines the idea that's applicable to cis men everywhere in the world, right? Oh, good. Atheist Jesus says nobody could hear the helicopter. Maybe I was just being offered a free helicopter ride. You're talking about the wrong things. Would you like a free helicopter ride? But to me, the toxic masculinity narrative clicked as this is the feminist movement, the academic end of the feminist movement, trying to impose gender dysphoria on cis men through writing about masculinity as a trap, as a prison in which men are trapped. And that explained everything to me. It explained why the entire narrative essentially generalizes dysfunction to all men and genders dysfunction that both sexes engage in as male behaviors.
Yeah, and plus it explains a lot about what they're doing in the new APA guidelines that you had also mentioned in opening monologue. Like just reading that whole thing, it just makes me want to die inside. I swear, it's just like, you guys are making mincemeat of my chosen profession. Why, God? Why? But I mean, it's embarrassing to read. Really, it's not going to be helpful to like young men growing up. It's not going to be helpful to men who have already grown up, who are supposedly embroiled in these toxic qualities. Like, what kind of a statement is that to make to anybody, really? Like, this part of you that has apparently been socialized into you is toxic, and that's how we're going to treat it. So, come to us, because that's clearly what you want to hear, right?
Yeah.
There's just
it's not even socialized. It's like you're born with it. You're born with this defect, and it makes everything in the world just shit just because you were born a man.
Well, there's some of it. They do attribute a lot of it to nurture rather than nature. The concept of hegemonic masculinity, like I described, that's their way of saying society expects men to engage in a certain set of behaviors because they are men. That's which I can give them hegemonic masculinity, even though that idea of socially imposed hegemony comes from Marxism, there's a degree to which, you have social expectations. That's what peer pressure is. That's why addressing the fact that teenagers engage in risky drinking and drug use practices because they think it will make them look cool to other teenagers. Addressing that can be helpful if it's addressed properly. I don't think most adults address it properly. You have to find a way to make drugs and alcohol, abusive drugs and alcohol, look ridiculous and stupid and uncool. And it's very hard for adults to determine for teenagers what is ridiculous and stupid and uncool. But in any case, there is a degree to which, everybody acts like it's either the blank slate or, we're instinct machines. I don't agree with either of those schools. I think it's a little both.
No. Yeah.
But the idea of toxic masculinity is based on taking those social pressures and saying that uniquely, right, when men engage in violent behavior, or when men engage in self-destructive behavior, or when men suppress their needs, that the hierarchy of needs. I can't think of the name of. Brain is not working today. Anyway, the sort of that pyramid, that hierarchy of needs.
Maslow's hierarchy.
Maslow.
Yes, Maslow.
All I could think of was the name of a songwriter for music that I like on the Dr. Demento show. But it's like one letter. There's Laszlo and Gary, where it was a group. Okay. And so I'm like, I know it's not Laszlo. It's not Laszlo. Laszlo is a songwriter. Maslow. God. Yeah. Anyway, so when men start denying themselves those things, they treat that as a specifically masculine thing, as if women never do the same thing. Like women never experience suffering on behalf of their children, or to protect their husbands or anything like that. And as if women are never violent, or as if women are never dishonest and things like that.
For Pete's sake, they also listed things like adventure and ambition and risk-taking, and it's like, are you kidding me? These are not exclusively things that men do.
No, and they're not exclusively bad either. The reason men have success in the world, the reason that we have, great scientific advancements, the reason that we have all of the equipment that I am using right now to broadcast, and my co-hosts are using right now to participate in the broadcast, and you guys are all using right now to listen, is because men examine things and explore things and try things out and test them and build and grow things. That's toxic. When did that become toxic? The reason that we know what the makeup of the moon is, and the reason that we have active theories now about how it was created, is because men went there to look at it and bring parts of it back so they could take it into a lab and study it. And they faced all of the dangers it took to go. That's toxic? That's the idea that we might actually someday in the distant future be able to live on another planet, and if something happens to this one, humanity won't be destroyed forever. Happens because of men's risk-taking and exploration instincts. That wasn't women's idea, and women did not take all of the risks involved. We still haven't had a woman who has done anything in outer space that hasn't been done by a man first. They're looking at the possibility of a woman giving birth in space, which I think is a dumb idea. Birth in zero gravity. Can you imagine the fluids going everywhere?
God. Don't want to imagine that hitting.
Yeah. But your water broke. Everybody knows. All over the inside of the cabin. Yeah. So now everybody that's listening to the stream can throw up in unison. But in any case, and people are responding, I didn't need that image in my head. But yeah, this is toxic. The idea that men actually pioneer these things, the men's pioneering instinct is toxic. No, it's not toxic, and it's not toxic masculinity when sometimes it goes wrong, And women's pioneering instinct may be different from men's, but that doesn't make men's pioneering instinct toxic. It doesn't make women's better. It means that we were made to work together, we evolved to work together, and we contribute to two sides of a unit that helps our civilization move forward and has done so for centuries. And feminists want to break that. That really blows my mind. So this idea of the toxic masculinity narrative and the research on which it's based, and a lot of that is buried. Like most of Connell's work is dogma, not evidence-based, like studying of social patterns and stuff like that. It's not evidence-based. It's looking at aspects of society through a dogmatic filter and then drawing dogmatic conclusions and then using those conclusions as the next filter for the next examination. And when you get to the top of it and you look at this is what we're theorizing now about men, women, and society, what you basically have is that same house of cards, that same advocacy research scam where the underlying basis for the entire toxic masculinity narrative is gender dysphoria and Andrea Dworkin's hateful influence. So
yeah,
pretty messed up that can become so prevalent. But I mean, hey, I guess when the only peer-reviewed studies you have to back up any arguments are all feminist ones, I guess it's not surprising.
Right. It feels like this need to label everything men do as toxic, or it feels like it comes from a place of jealousy, right? Like it feels like a little kid who's finished with his ice cream, but he sees his sister has a whole bowl of ice cream and he wants that ice cream, even though he's already had it. He wants more, and it's not good enough because, well, I guess I should reverse the genders on that because we're talking about feminists. But anyway, you get my point. Like, it's what they have is not good enough. And anything good that a man has, it's got to be, manipulated, or either I want it or you can't have it because I can't have it.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I mean, and just like think about it another way too, right? Like if they tried to if the APA put out something talking about like toxically feminine behaviors, or if they tried to portray any of the more negative aspects of femininity as traditional femininity as a whole, and then talk down about that, like gossiping, nagging, focus on resource acquisition, like
forget it. There would be an uproar, right? It's how dare you label all women this? Hashtag not all women. Forget it.
No, they do it the other way around.
Shit.
Mm-hmm. They do the other way around. They turn around and say things that women are expected to do for the benefit of others. Like, and they assume that women's only reason for wanting to raise children is because they are expected to raise children. That women's only reason for wanting to take care of their families is because they're socially expected to take care of their families. That women's only reason for not wanting a career during which they have to go to work every day, work as hard as the men, take on as many challenges as the men, take the risks the men take, and offer the same performance as the men, is because society dampens or hinders that interest. Societal expectations of women force women to not have those interests and desires, or to suppress them. And that's their toxic masculinity narrative. If you look at the two side by side, anytime men act in their self-interest, in their own perceived self-interest, in a way that feminists disapprove, it is toxic masculinity, right? And anytime women act in anyone else's interest in a way that feminists disapprove, it's toxic femininity. So that's their way of dealing with that. But yeah, they would scream from the heavens if you turned around and said, well, nagging is toxic femininity. No, it's women's voices are being suppressed. You can't call them nags for making unreasonable demands and then repeating them until they get accommodated. Which is basically what nagging is. And which is why I call it abuse. But yeah, this is one of those inequalities in feminism. They don't have the same attitude towards the same types of behaviors among both sexes. They use the same kind of labeling for different behaviors between the sexes, and the reason is that the feminist attitude is men are not allowed to have their self-interest as their primary reason for doing anything ever. And women are not allowed to have altruism as their primary reason for doing anything ever.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So, and of course, then you also have men are not allowed to escape accountability for anything, including women's choices. And women are not allowed to exercise accountability. And nobody is allowed to hold women accountable for anything. So, and those filters get heavily used in feminist research. Where I mentioned they talk about the underlying reasons behind abuse. That one piece of research that I had read, and I need to go back and find it because where I read that, I don't have a link for that one in the article, and I need to put it in there. That blew my mind when I saw that. They went through and they described abusing a partner on suspicion of cheating. And they really seriously described it as power and control when men do it. And as the woman defending herself against feeling disrespected and dehumanized.
Oh my God.
Wow.
Piss off.
Yeah. No, he's trying to control her sexuality. That's why he was aggressive when he found out she might be cheating, or when he believed that she was cheating. But she's not controlling his sexuality. When she believes he's cheating, she feels disrespected and dehumanized because of the betrayal. Right? That's the feminist research filter behind the scam. And so,
gross.
Yep. But with that, I think we're pretty much through. I'm gonna read the last. I think we got another super chat. Crawl Dragon gave us $10 and quoted Ron White. He said, this is a great thought to leave you guys on. Some scientists once did research to determine whether it's dangerous for a woman to have a period in space. Yeah, it's dangerous. In a weightless environment, the psycho bitches can fly.
Oh my God.
Oh. So if either you guys have any final thoughts on this before I bid us all farewell?
The only thing I'll say to that last remark is that you have the benefit being in zero gravity. If she throws something at you, you have much more time to get away from it.
There you go.
That's true. There you go.
It depends. You got to remember, force equals mass times acceleration, and in space there might be, well, if you don't have an environment inside your cabin and you're actually, there's no friction to slow it down. So it might just fly slower because the bitch can't throw. She throws like a girl.
Oh dear.
So with that, I'd like to thank my co-hosts for doing this show with me, and thank the audience for listening and tolerating our horrible jokes about bodily fluids flying in space. Thanks everybody who helps to make HBR Talk happen, everyone in the background. A lot of work goes into the opening video, and there's a lot of background work that goes into the opening video. And good night, all.
Good night.